Whispers on Tuba Street. They said the screams didn't sound human. Not the sharp cries of street brawls, not the muffled sobs of beaten servants, not even the desperate shouts of women caught in the sudden violence that prowled the alleys of late 19th century Mexico City. No, what drifted over the high stone walls of the mansion on Tuba Street in the winter of 1892 was something else. Something that made seasoned policemen freeze in their tracks. Something that mothers would later whisper about to their children as a warning. Don't linger near that house, because what lived inside was not bound by the rules of God or man. Behind those wrought iron balconies, where candles flickered and tall glass holders and lace curtains swayed in the cold night air, a widow of impeccable reputation orchestrated horrors too precise, too calculated to be dismissed as madness. Neighbors swore the cries went on for hours, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost musical, as though someone was conducting agony like a symphony. When the sound stopped, silence pressed against the neighborhood like a weight, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and something metallic, something people couldn't name, but would later recognize instantly as the scent of blood. This was not the chaos of revolution, not the randomness of urban crime. It was methodical. It was hidden in plain sight, and it would soon reveal Mexico's first known female serial killer, a woman whose crimes were so unspeakable that even time tried to bury them. A city of contradictions. To understand how Guadalupe Bejarano thrived, you must first understand the city that sheltered her. It was 1887. President Porfirio Diaz was transforming Mexico City into what he imagined as the Paris of the Americas. Gas lamps lit wide boulevards where carriages rattled past newly built cafes, and European fashions paraded in defiance of the poverty just blocks away. On one street, women in imported silk fanned themselves beneath chandeliers. On the next, indigenous families slept on bare stone floors, their children hollow-eyed with hunger. The city was a patchwork of opulence and despair, and in that patchwork, predators found their prey. Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano fit perfectly into the performance of respectability. At 43, she carried herself like a woman carved from discipline and grief. Widowed young, she had inherited her late husband's business connections and maintained them with a precision that inspired admiration. Her two-story mansion on Tuba Street was not the grandest, but its pink limestone walls and iron balconies symbolized stability, respect, and moral authority. She was tall, severe, always in black widow's weeds that emphasized her angular features. Her neighbors saw her as devout, charitable, untouchable. But her true sanctuary wasn't the church or the drawing rooms of Mexico's elite. It was the locked basement beneath her home, a place she thought of not as a dungeon but as a classroom. The method of training. Guadalupe's respectability was built on a business both common and quietly sinister. She supplied domestic servants to the city's wealthiest families. Desperate parents from impoverished villages sent their daughters to her, believing that domestic service in the capital was a step toward survival. For many, it was the only chance to escape famine, debt, or ruin. These girls arrived with nothing. No connections, no documents, often not even the ability to write their own names. They entered Guadalupe's house like sheep to a shepherd. What they didn't know was that their new employer believed she had a gift, what she called her special method of training. At first, her punishments could pass as strict discipline, withholding meals, forcing girls to scrub floors until their knees bled, keeping them standing motionless for hours. Neighbors might have dismissed the cries as the harsh but ordinary sounds of servant life. But behind closed doors, those methods evolved. Punishment became experimentation. Correction became cruelty, and cruelty became murder. A son in Shadows Inn. The upper rooms of the mansion lived Guadalupe's son Aurelio. At 22, he moved through the house like a ghost, pale and jittery, plagued by a stutter that made him sound like a child despite his age. He had grown up with the sounds from the basement, each scream carving itself into his nervous system. By the time he was a man, he had learned to numb himself with laudanum, slipping into a haze that dulled the horrors below. He knew his mother was not like other women. He knew her discipline wasn't truly about improving servants. But he also knew what happened to those who questioned her methods. Sometimes, when her eyes glittered with that strange light, she would remind him that obedience wasn't just for the servants. If he forgot his place, he could join them. Casimira's arrival. The final descent began on a gray morning in January 1887. 16-year-old Casimira Juarez arrived at the mansion's heavy wooden doors after a 6-day journey from Michoacán. She had lost her parents to cholera. She carried her entire world in a cloth bundle. Her parish priest had given her a letter recommending Señora Bejarano, who was said to help girls find honest work. Guadalupe opened the door herself. The girl was exactly what she looked for: young, vulnerable, alone. Her patched dress, her neatly braided hair, her eyes full of fear and gratitude, they were invitations. "I can see you've been raised properly," Guadalupe said, her voice low and commanding as she scanned the priest's letter. "Good references are essential in my household. I maintain very high standards." The girl bowed her head. "Sí, señora." Inside, Casimira saw a house of marble floors, oil paintings of saints, and furniture carved from dark mahogany. It was wealth and holiness entwined. Guadalupe showed her a small room with a narrow bed and a crucifix on the wall. "You'll find I treat my servants fairly," Guadalupe said, "but I expect absolute obedience and discretion." For 2 weeks, life seemed bearable. Casimira rose before dawn, scrubbed floors, mended clothes, helped with meals. She worked hard, and when Guadalupe watched her with those unblinking eyes, she thought it was simply the strictness of a careful mistress. But Guadalupe wasn't watching the work. She was studying the girl's spirit. Escalation, it began with invisible dust on a polished table, wrinkles in a press sheet, food that was somehow wrong, though the recipe had been followed. "I'm beginning to think you're not as well trained as your priest claimed," Guadalupe said one evening, her voice sharp enough to make Casimira tremble. "Perhaps you need more intensive instruction." The punishments grew, standing motionless until her legs buckled, missing meals for being clumsy, scrubbing until her hands bled, then being scolded for staining the stone with her blood. Aurelio saw the signs. He had seen them before. He tried once timidly to protest. "Mother." "The girl. She is suffering." Guadalupe's eyes turned, cold. "Would you like to join her lessons, Aurelio? Perhaps you need instruction in obedience too." The boy retreated and increased his laudanum. The descent into night. By February, Casimira's world was a nightmare. Guadalupe moved her into the basement. The room was stone and shadows, lit by the flicker of a brazier. Chains clinked faintly when the air shifted. The girl was stripped of her clothes, forced to stand naked as Guadalupe circled her like a hawk. "You see how ugly you've become?" the widow whispered, her tone almost tender. "This is what happens when servants forget their place. But don't worry, Ad, I will help you remember." The brazier that once warmed rooms became a forge of torment. Iron heated until it glowed, then hovered near skin until terror broke the girl's composure before pain even touched her. When burns did come, they were quick, precise, designed to hurt but not kill. And between sessions, Guadalupe was meticulous. She tended the wounds with salves, enough to heal just enough so the cycle could continue. She whispered prayers, forced confessions, demanded gratitude. She twisted the girl's mind until Casimira began to believe she deserved it. Above, Aurelio wrote in his journal with a trembling hand. February 15th. The screaming was worse last night. Mother says it's for the girl's moral improvement. God, help me, I think she enjoys it. February 22. Blood on the cellar stairs. Mother says an accident during cooking lessons. What kind of lesson needs so much blood? February 28. Haven't seen Casimira upstairs. Mother says she's ill. But the sounds, they are not illness. The first murder in March, after 6 weeks of torture, Casimira's body gave out. Her heart simply stopped in the middle of what Guadalupe called a correction. For a moment, the widow stared at the lifeless body with something like disappointment. Then, satisfaction. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. She wrapped the body in sheets, loaded it onto a cart under cover of night, and buried it in a vacant lot on the city's edge. As the soil swallowed Casimira, Guadalupe made a decision. This would not be her last, and as neighbors whispered about strange smells rising from Tuba Street, and Aurelio sank deeper into his drugged haze, the widow of Mexico City began planning her next victim. The widow's refinement. The mansion on Tuba Street looked unchanged from the outside. Its pink limestone walls caught the morning sun as church bells tolled across Mexico City, and passers-by might have seen Señora Guadalupe Bejarano leaving for Mass, rosary glinting in her gloved hands. They whispered admiration. A woman of means, a woman of faith, a widow who turned her grief into charity. But inside those walls, the house had become a tomb. Casimira Juarez was gone, swallowed by a shallow grave on the city's outskirts, and, with her absence came a silence that pressed heavy on the rooms. Only Aurelio felt it, the wrongness that clung to the curtains, the floorboards, the walls that had absorbed too many screams. His mother moved through the house with an unsettling vitality, as though Casimira's death had invigorated her rather than burdened her conscience. For nearly a year, Guadalupe played her role with perfection. She threw herself into charity, fundraisers, expanded her servant placement business, and hosted gatherings where priests praised her generosity. In public, she was serene, benevolent. In private, she wrote, pages upon pages filled with neat handwriting as she dissected her own methods, identifying errors, planning improvements. She had discovered her calling, and now she would refine it. Elena Santos. In September 1888, opportunity arrived in the form of Maria Santos and her 15-year-old daughter, Elena. Maria had lost her farm to drought and debt, and desperation drove her to Mexico City. She came to Tuba Street with her daughter in tow, clutching a letter of introduction and the trembling hope that her child might secure respectable work. Elena was everything Guadalupe sought. Strong, healthy, with the kind of quiet resilience that radiated dignity even through hardship. It was precisely that dignity that drew the widow in. Breaking a strong spirit promised a deeper satisfaction than shattering one already beaten down. Guadalupe welcomed them with a smile that carried maternal warmth. "I can certainly use your daughter," she said, "and you may rest easy knowing she will be under my personal guidance. Many girls have found their place in society through me." Maria wept with gratitude. Elena lowered her head, whispering, "Gracias, señora." They believed they had found salvation. In truth, they had entered a cage. The web tightens at first. Elena's life mirrored Casimira's early days. The routines of cleaning, sewing, and cooking seemed almost merciful compared to the hunger she had known in the countryside. Guadalupe praised her efforts with just enough warmth to plant trust, but slowly the pattern shifted. "I notice you've been making more mistakes lately," Guadalupe remarked one afternoon, standing over a spotless table. "Perhaps the city air doesn't agree with you. Some girls from the countryside never adapt properly," Elena protested, voice trembling. "I try my best, señora." Guadalupe smiled faintly. "Effort is not the same as achievement, my dear." The words lodged, like splinters. Soon every task felt like a test she was destined to fail. The punishments followed, standing motionless until her body trembled, meals withheld for supposed disobedience, nights spent in the coal cellar where rats scurried in the dark. Unlike with Casimira, Guadalupe moved slowly. Each punishment was spaced out, each cruelty calculated to seem like a natural extension of the last. Elena was trapped in a spiral too gradual to recognize until it was too late. Aurelio's helpless. Witnessing. From his room above, Aurelio noticed the change. He saw how Elena's posture stiffened, how her eyes dimmed. He tried again to intervene. "Mother, the girl is frightened," he whispered one evening. Guadalupe turned her gaze on him, patient but edged with steel. "Do you believe you understand moral instruction better than I, Aurelio? If so, perhaps you would like to take responsibility for her training yourself." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Aurelio retreated, as always, to his laudanum. His journal recorded his dread, October 3rd, 1888. Elena's face is thinner now. She avoids looking at me. I think she knows I cannot help her. God forgive me. The basement reopens by December. Guadalupe judged Elena sufficiently broken to descend to the basement. The room had changed since Casimira. New restraints had been commissioned from a blacksmith, their iron links polished by testing. A chair-like device sat in one corner, its design justified publicly as an invalid's seat but in truth crafted for immobilization. When Elena was first secured, Guadalupe explained in her calmest voice, "The most important quality in a servant is obedience. Obedience requires understanding, and understanding sometimes requires experiences that feel unpleasant. But everything I do here is for your benefit." The girl wept silently, too afraid to protest. What followed was not chaos, but ritual. The brazier glowed steadily as implements were heated and cooled. A knife pressed against skin, shallow enough to sting but not bleed heavily. Periods of torment alternated with moments of false kindness. A salve applied gently, a word of comfort, a whispered prayer. The contrast left Elena bewildered, unable to discern whether she was being punished or saved. A theology of cruelty. What made Elena's ordeal different from Casimira's was Guadalupe's new philosophy. "This is purification," she whispered one night while binding Elena's wrists. "Some souls are heavy with sin. Suffering burns it away like fire to gold." She began quoting scripture, twisting verses into justifications. To her mind, she was no longer a sadist, but an instrument of divine will. Torture became sacrament. Pain became purification. Elena, her body covered in bruises and burns, began to repeat the words back in broken whispers, clinging to them as fragments of meaning in the storm. The final ordeal by late December. Elena was a shell. She obeyed commands, with mechanical precision, eyes hollow, voice flat. Guadalupe decided it was time for the finale. For 3 days she orchestrated what she called the complete instruction. Sessions of torment extended into hours, punctuated by intervals of false tenderness. "You see, my dear," she whispered, as she applied ointment to wounds she had inflicted. "This is all for your good. You will thank me in the end." Elena's heart failed before the performance could conclude. She died strapped to the chair, her body broken, her spirit extinguished. Guadalupe stared at the lifeless girl, frustration gnawing at her. It had ended too soon, the finale cut short. But beneath the disappointment was satisfaction. She had learned. She had refined. Next time, she would do better. Disappearance. When Maria Santos returned weeks later, frantic at her daughter's silence, Guadalupe was prepared. "Elena fell ill after Christmas," she said with practiced sorrow, "a fever that unsettled her mind. She became convinced you were in danger and insisted on leaving to find you. I begged her to wait, but she would not listen." The lie was delivered with such conviction that Maria believed. She left in tears, imagining her daughter wandering the countryside. She never knew Elena's bones already lay in the soil beyond the city. A perfect façade in the months that followed, Guadalupe perfected her double life. By day, she organized relief for earthquake victims, funded orphanages, and knelt in the front pew of Sunday Mass. By night, she planned. She mapped out methods, identified improvements, and studied anatomy with the precision of a physician. Her reputation soared. Priests praised her. Families trusted her with their daughters. Neighbors admired her devotion. And all the while, the basement waited. By 1892, Guadalupe was ready for her most ambitious project yet. Not one victim, but 3. When Esperanza Vega knocked at her door with her 2 younger sisters, Guadalupe's eyes glittered with anticipation. She welcomed them warmly. "In fact, it will be ideal to have sisters together. You can support each other, and I find family bonds very instructive." None of them realized that those bonds would become the instruments of their destruction. The Symphony of Suffering. The Vega sisters arrived at the mansion on a bright spring morning in 1892, the sun gilding Tuba Street in warmth that promised hope. Esperanza, 19, led the way with shoulders squared and chin raised, the reluctant mother figure since political violence and famine had scattered their family. Behind her walked Carmen, 17, quiet and nervous, clutching the hand of Rosa, the youngest at 15, whose sharp eyes darted from balcony to doorway as though she could see danger hidden in the very stones. Guadalupe Bejarano studied them from her doorway with the detached delight of a collector examining rare specimens. 3 sisters, 3 souls bound by blood and loyalty. She smiled with practiced maternal warmth. "You'll find I run a household of high standards," she said, her voice carrying the solemnity of a priestess. "But together, you will thrive." What she did not say was that she had been preparing for precisely this scenario. For years, she had wondered how family bonds could be twisted into chains stronger than iron. Now she had the perfect chance to test her theories. The first month, false spring. The sisters' first weeks seemed almost idyllic compared to what they had known. Adequate food, light work, even occasional afternoons to stroll the city together. Guadalupe understood that cruelty was most effective when it followed comfort. She needed them to feel safe, to lower their guard, to bind themselves emotionally to the house before she began dismantling their trust. She began with subtle seeds of division. "Rosa has such quick hands," she remarked to Esperanza one afternoon, "a natural servant. Carmen, however, perhaps she requires more instruction." Or to Rosa, in a confidential tone, "Your elder sister tries, but her pride blinds her. Do you see how often she defies my corrections?" Each word was calculated to erode solidarity. Soon the sisters began to second-guess each other. A look that once meant affection now carried suspicion. A mistake once forgiven now stirred resentment. Guadalupe watched these fractures widen, and in her journals she wrote, May 12, 1892. Division achieved. The key is praise and blame delivered unequally. Family bonds bend before they break. Descent. Into the basement by June, she judged them ready. The basement had been renovated once again. Where once there was a single chair, there were now 3, iron-framed, padded just enough to keep a body alive while restrained. They were positioned in a triangle, each facing the others. Whatever one endured, the others would witness. When she led the sisters down, she maintained her calmest voice. "This is the training room," she said. "Some lessons require more intensive instruction. You'll thank me in time." The girls were secured, not harmed at first, just made to feel the helplessness of restraint. Guadalupe explained her philosophy as though lecturing students. Obedience, purification, sacrifice. Then the demonstrations began. Heated metal touched briefly, to skin. Water poured until breath came in frantic gasps. Small shocks from a primitive battery that made muscles spasm uncontrollably. But the true cruelty was not the pain itself. It was the forced witnessing. "You see, Carmen, how your resistance prolongs your sister's suffering?" Guadalupe would remark as Rosa screamed. "And Rosa, notice how Esperanza's pride forces me to be harsher with you." The sisters' love, once their strength, became their torment. Aurelio's breaking point above, Aurelio heard everything. The house reverberated with screams layered over each other, a chorus that no laudanum could fully erase. He began writing frantically, his journals filling with jagged lines. June 20th. 3 voices now. They echo through the floorboards. Mother calls it instruction. I call it hell. July 2. Rosa begs not for herself but for her sisters. Mother laughs. She says love is the sharpest tool. He felt himself unraveling. Sometimes he thought he saw shadows moving in corners where no one stood. Sometimes he imagined he heard Casimira's voice whispering from the grave. But more than madness, something else grew inside him. Fear. He knew that one day his mother would demand his participation, and if he refused, he might join the sisters in the basement. The ritual of guilt. By August, the sisters were transformed. Esperanza, once the strong protector, now collapsed into catatonia between punishments, broken by guilt at bringing her siblings to Mexico City. Carmen retreated into a madness so deep that she laughed during torture, her mind shielding itself in delirium. Rosa remained lucid, but that clarity was its own torment. She knew the truth. There was no rescue, no mercy, no way out. Guadalupe exploited this mercilessly. She offered choices designed to corrode love into guilt. Esperanza, she whispered one night, your sisters suffer because of your decisions. Would you not take their punishments onto yourself as a true protector should? When Esperanza begged to bear the pain, Guadalupe agreed, only to later insist the others must share responsibility. Every sacrifice was turned against them. Every gesture of love twisted into another blade. In her journals, Guadalupe recorded with scientific detachment, August 17th, discovering that guilt magnifies pain. To make one suffer, harm the beloved. To make three suffer, bind their suffering together. The mask slips even as she perfected her methods. Cracks began to show in Guadalupe's facade. She forgot appointments, appeared at mass with disheveled hair, spoke aloud to herself during meals. Her eyes burned with a feverish brightness. One night she summoned Aurelio to dinner and spoke as if addressing a pupil. I think you are old enough now to understand the realities of human nature, she said, slicing her meat with surgical precision. Perhaps it is time you observed my work directly. Aurelio nearly dropped his fork. Mother, her gaze froze him. It is your duty, Aurelio. Our family must share this burden. He feigned illness to escape, but he knew the reprieve would not last. Terror gnawed at him. Would he become witness, accomplice, or victim? As autumn deepened, Guadalupe began planning her final performance with the Vega sisters, a drawn-out ordeal meant to push them and herself to the brink. But Aurelio, teetering between madness and clarity, began preparing something of his own. In secret, he shared fragments of his journals with Father Miguel Herrera, the parish priest. Save me, he whispered one night, eyes hollow. Save them, or I will end like them. And on the night Guadalupe prepared her most elaborate ritual, the faint sound of church bells rang down Tuba Street, signaling forces stirring against her. The widow of Mexico City was no longer entirely in control. Cracks in the facade. The first real danger to Guadalupe Bejarano did not come from neighbors, nor from suspicious tradesmen, nor even from the screams that sometimes pierced the walls of Tuba Street and drifted into midnight air. It came from her own son. For years, Aurelio had been little more than a shadow, drifting through the mansion's upper rooms, numbing himself with laudanum, scribbling in journals that no one was meant to read. But terror had a way of forcing clarity, and when his mother began speaking of his duty to participate in her lessons, Aurelio knew that silence was no longer survival, it was suicide. He had spent nights staring at his trembling hands, pen clutched like a weapon, recording every detail he could recall, dates, names, the cries that shook the walls, the instruments he glimpsed in the basement. His writing grew frantic, jagged, smeared with opium-stained sweat. Yet buried in the madness was truth. And in December 1892, truth found its way to the ears of Father Miguel Herrera, a priest's suspicion. Father Herrera had long admired Señora Bejarano. Her donations to the cathedral, her piety at Mass, her constant presence in charitable work. She was the very model of Catholic widowhood. But priests heard confessions in whispers, and even the most gilded lives shed shadows. He had begun to hear troubling rumors. Girls disappearing without word to their families, tradesmen asked to build medical devices with sinister designs, and neighbors speaking in hushed tones of screams that went on long into the night. When Aurelio came to him, pale, shaking, stuttering out fragments of horror, the priest felt the bottom of the world shift. They are in the basement, Aurelio gasped, pressing his journals into the priest's hands. I hear them. I write it all down. You must stop her." Father Herrera opened the pages and nearly dropped them. Dates, names, descriptions, so precise they could not be dismissed as delirium. He closed the book with trembling fingers and crossed himself. "My son," he whispered, "if this is true, then your mother is not merely sinful, she is something far worse." The mask wavers. While Aurelio whispered to priests, Guadalupe's composure began to fray in public. At a charity luncheon in January 1893, she arrived late, her veil crooked, her hands trembling as she poured tea. A senator's wife remarked later that Señora Bejarano seemed to mutter to herself during conversation, her lips moving in private dialogue with invisible companions. At Mass, she lingered too long at the altar, staring at the crucifix with an intensity that unsettled even the archbishop. Some claimed they heard her whispering prayers not of mercy but of fire and punishment, as though she believed herself a co-author of God's law, and still the noises from her house grew harder to ignore. A neighbor swore he smelled burning flesh on the night air. Another claimed that her windows glowed not with candlelight but with something harsher like a forge. But who would accuse a woman so charitable, so respected? Respectability was its own armor, and Guadalupe wore it like steel. The night of Belsan, New Year's Day 1893, Father Herrera came to deliver her annual receipt of donation. It should have been a simple courtesy, but it became the first real breach in her fortress. As he waited in her parlor, sipping chocolate from porcelain, he heard it. Muffled, rising, unmistakable. A scream, ragged with agony, clawing its way through stone. He froze, the cup rattling in its saucer. "Señora Bejarano?" he asked, when she swept in moments later, cheeks flushed, veil slightly askew. "Is someone ill in your household?" "Those sounds." Her smile did not falter. "One of the servants suffers from fever," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "Delirium, poor child. We must endure her cries as she endures her affliction." The priest bowed his head, but doubt gnawed his heart. Later he would confess to colleagues, that was not the sound of fever, that was the sound of a soul breaking. Evidence piles up as weeks passed, whispers hardened into testimonies. A blacksmith admitted he had been paid to construct devices that resembled restraints more than furniture. A physician confessed he had sold medical instruments and tinctures in quantities no normal household could justify. Shopkeepers noted that her purchases of food had dwindled even as her supposed staff grew. Still, all of this was circumstantial, and Guadalupe remained untouchable until Aurelio. His journals, now copied by Father Herrera, contained maps of the basement, sketches of restraints, even crude depictions of wounds he had glimpsed on terrified girls. Most damning of all, he had marked burial sites, empty lots on the city's periphery where he swore bodies had been hidden. In February, investigators dug at one of those sites. Beneath shallow earth, they found bones. Guadalupe's transformation. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Guadalupe prepared her final lesson for the Vega sisters. Months of torment had reduced them to shadows. Esperanza catatonic, Carmen lost in madness, Rosa clinging to reason with bleeding fingers. Guadalupe dressed in ceremonial black, her hair braided like a nun's, her rosary dangling at her waist. She moved with a solemnity that resembled devotion. To her, this was not cruelty but liturgy. "This evening," she told the sisters, tightening straps with careful hands, "we complete your purification. You should be honored. Few souls are chosen for such refinement." As the brazier glowed and chains rattled, she began her ritual of pain with a serenity that was almost holy. She did not know that upstairs, Aurelio was unlocking the back door. That night, February 14th, 1893, while screams rose again from beneath the mansion, a small group of investigators crept silently through the garden, guided by Aurelio's shaking hands. They reached the basement door. Behind it came the unmistakable sound of iron on flesh, followed by a cry that seemed to tear through the soul itself. An officer whispered a prayer. Another vomited in the corner. "On my signal," the captain said, lifting his lantern. The lock Clicked. The door swung open, and what they saw inside the widow's basement would scar Mexico's memory forever. The widow unveiled. The door to the basement of Tuba Street swung open on a hinge that shrieked like something alive. Lantern light cut into darkness, revealing a scene so grotesque that hardened officers staggered back, retching. The Vega sisters were strapped into iron chairs, their bodies little more than maps of agony. Esperanza slumped unconscious, skin mottled with burns and cuts layered like sediment from years of torment. Carmen's eyes rolled back, lips muttering nonsense to companions no one else could see. Rosa, the youngest, lifted her head weakly when the light struck, and in a hoarse whisper begged for death. But it was not the sisters who froze the intruder's blood. It was Guadalupe Bejarano herself. She turned calmly, instruments still in her hands, dressed in ceremonial black as though for a mass. Her expression was not surprise, not fear, but mild irritation, like a hostess interrupted during a private rehearsal. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice as precise as ever, "I trust you have proper authorization for this intrusion into my household affairs?" The Chamber of Horrors lanterns illuminated the rest. Chains worn smooth by struggling wrists, iron implements blackened by fire, journals filled with diagrams of anatomy annotated with cold precision. On a shelf sat a collection of ribbons, hair, braids and rosaries, trophies from vanished girls. One officer dropped his lantern in shock, nearly setting the room ablaze. Another lunged forward to strike her, only to be restrained by his captain. "Secure her," the captain barked, though his own voice shook, "and free the girls." As guards dragged Guadalupe upstairs, she did not resist. She carried herself with dignity, chin raised, lips murmuring prayers. To the investigators, it was more chilling than defiance. The City Reacts news spread like wildfire. By dawn, Mexico City was aflame with whispers. Senora Bejarano, the charitable widow, the devout Catholic, the woman who fed orphans and funded altars, had been unmasked as a monster. Crowds gathered outside the mansion, demanding to see her face. Journalists swarmed, sketchpads ready, their headlines already sharpening. The widow of Tuba Street exposed. Charity as camouflage for evil. High society recoiled in horror. Families who had once entrusted her with their daughters now wondered if their missing children had met her iron devices. Priests who praised her from the pulpit now trembled at their complicity. Even the president's men whispered, if a woman like Bejarano could be a predator, who among the elite was safe from suspicion? Aurelio on the stand-in the days that followed. Aurelio became both witness and victim. Investigators spread his journals across tables, marveling at their detail. "You recorded all of this?" one asked, half in awe, half in revulsion. Aurelio nodded, trembling. I couldn't stop her, but I couldn't let it be forgotten." At the preliminary hearings, he was forced to speak aloud what he had only dared write in secret. The screams, the blood, the smell of burning flesh that had haunted him since childhood. The courtroom watched him crumble under the weight of memory, his stammer breaking into sobs, his hands shaking so violently that he spilled water across the floor. The defense tried to paint him as insane, unfit to testify, but the evidence in his journals matched too perfectly with the instruments, the journals, and the bones unearthed in shallow graves. For Aurelio, it was vindication and damnation. He was no longer invisible. He was the boy who had lived in a house of screams and done nothing until too late. Guadalupe's Theater Guadalupe, for her part, treated the trial like a stage. She sat upright, veiled in black, her rosary glinting between her fingers. When asked to explain the torture devices, she spoke with the calm patience of a teacher. "These girls came to me as peasants," she explained, her tone patronizing. "Ignorant, lazy, in need of correction. What I provided was moral instruction, purification of the soul through necessary suffering. Would you accuse a doctor of cruelty for lancing an infection?" The words chilled the courtroom. She was not insane in the foaming, incoherent sense. She was lucid, logical, convinced of her righteousness, and that made her more terrifying than madness ever could. The people's judgment, Outside, Jose Guadalupe Posada, Mexico's famed illustrator, sketched her trial for the broadsheets. His engravings captured her serene face against the backdrop of torture devices, her elegant veil contrasting with the broken forms of the Vega sisters. His art spread faster than words, searing her image into the nation's nightmares. In cantinas, men slammed their mugs and cursed her name. Women clutched their children tighter. Street preachers shouted that the devil wore black silk and sat in the front pew of Mass. And yet, even as the nation demanded her death, the court hesitated. Mexico had never prosecuted a woman for serial murder. To hang her would be unprecedented, politically dangerous. The verdict in September 1893, the verdict came, guilty of murder. Guilty of torture. Guilty of crimes so unprecedented that the court struggled to name them. But the sentence? 10 years and 8 months in prison. The courtroom erupted. Citizens screamed that justice had been mocked. Guards had to form a barrier to keep the mob from tearing her apart on the spot. Guadalupe merely bowed her head, murmuring, "Fiat voluntas Dei, thy will be done." The Vega sisters' fate. Of the 3 sisters, Esperanza died within weeks of rescue, her body too ravaged to endure. Carmen and Rosa lived but were forever altered. One lost in madness, the other broken by trauma so deep she never spoke a full sentence again. Their survival was proof enough for the public. The widow of Tuba Street had not been merely cruel. She had been systematic, methodical, a scientist of agony. When guards led her into the gates of Carcel de Belén, prisoners jeered, spat, hurled stones. Even murderers, thieves, and prostitutes saw her as beneath them. She was placed in solitary confinement for her own safety, alone with her rosary and her endless journals. But within those walls, Guadalupe was not finished. She began writing again, filling page after page with new theories, new methods, new ideas for purification. Guards reported hearing her speak softly in the dark, as though instructing invisible pupils. And on cold nights, when the wind howled through the prisons, iron bars, inmates swore they heard something worse than prayers. They heard laughter, echoes in stone. The iron gates of Carcel de Belén closed behind Guadalupe Bejarano, with a clang that echoed like judgment itself. Outside, mobs had demanded her blood. Inside, she faced a different kind of tribunal. Prisoners, hardened by theft, murder, and betrayal, drew lines that even they would not cross. They spat through bars when she passed. They whispered bruja and made the sign of the cross. To them, she was not merely a criminal. She was an aberration, a woman who had traded her womb for a forge and turned motherhood into torment. For the first time in her life, Guadalupe was powerless. Guards placed her in solitary, for her, safety, though everyone knew the truth. If she were left among the general population, she would not survive a night. The widow in her cell was a narrow stone box, damp and perpetually cold. Rats scurried across the floor at night, gnawing the edges of the straw mattress. The widow who once swept through salons in silks and veils now sat hunched in rags, her skin pallid, her once severe features hollowed by hunger. And yet, she carried herself with dignity. Each morning, she prayed loudly, rosary beads rattling, like chains. Each evening, she wrote in journals smuggled to her by sympathetic guards who found her calm unsettling, but her intellect fascinating. They described her as a professor of cruelty, lecturing an audience that no longer existed. In those pages, she did not repent. She refined. She theorized. She wrote of pain as pedagogy, of suffering as salvation. Guards who peeked at her writing swore they felt a sickness crawl under their skin, as if the words themselves carried infection. The prison's judgment other inmates, however, had no patience for her philosophy. When she was marched through the courtyard for exercise, insults rained down. Prostitutes cursed her as a hypocrite who destroyed girls instead of saving them. Thieves mocked her rosaries, calling her Santa de los Demonios. Murderers, men who had slit throats in alleyways, spat at her feet. Once, someone hurled a sharpened spoon that grazed her cheek. Another time, a bucket of filth was dumped over her veil. The guards did little to protect her. Most secretly agreed she deserved it. For Guadalupe, this was torment greater than chains, not the loss of freedom, but the loss of reverence. To be treated not as a figure of authority, but as vermin. The son's silence Aurelio did not visit. He had been sentenced himself, 2 years for complicity. Yet by the time he was released, he was a ghost of a man. His laudanum habit consumed him, his health broken, his mind frayed. He vanished into obscurity, muttering of sins he could never expunge. Some said he drowned in an opium den. Others whispered he fled Mexico altogether, cursed to carry his mother's secrets across oceans. If Guadalupe longed for him, she did not show it. She told guards she had been chosen to walk alone. The final winter by 1895, her body began to betray her. Pneumonia stalked the prison in damp winds that winter, and the widow's lungs rattled with each breath. Her once commanding voice became a rasp. Her journals grew fragmented, sentences trailing into illegible scrawls. Yet until the end, she remained defiant. She never begged, a guard recalled. Not for food, not for mercy, not even for confession. She said she had already confessed, to God directly, not to men. One freezing dawn, she was found collapsed on her mattress, her lips tinged blue. Officially, the cause of death was pneumonia. Unofficially, bruises on her body suggested something else. A beating, perhaps, from prisoners who had slipped past the guards, or from guards themselves who finally decided justice needed an extra push. No investigation followed. Few cared. Her burial was swift and anonymous. No family claimed the body. A priest read prayers without passion. Her grave was left unmarked, swallowed by weeds. For most, that should have been the end. Folklore awakens, but legends never die where silence and shame prevail. Workmen renovating the Tuba Street mansion decades later reported finding the basement, walls stained with marks that no lime wash could erase. Some swore they heard faint cries echo when the house stood empty. Others claimed to see a tall woman in black walking the corridors at night, rosary beads clinking like chains. Neighbors began telling stories. On windless nights, screams still rose from the soil where Guadalupe buried her victims. Children dared each other to walk past the ruins at midnight, whispering the name La Terrible, the terrifying one. And in markets across Mexico, José Guadalupe Posada's engravings of the widow became talismans, warnings in ink, a reminder that evil could wear silk gloves, kneel at the altar, and smile as it slaughtered. The twist. The mask that never dies. What unsettled Mexico most was not simply her crimes, but the revelation that no one had wanted to see. Priests, doctors, officials, all had turned away until screams broke through stone. Respectability had been her greatest disguise, and society itself her accomplice. Some whispered that Guadalupe had succeeded in her ultimate experiment, not just breaking her victims, but proving that truth itself could be bent, ignored, denied, and, in that way, she never truly died. In the back streets of Mexico City, mothers still warn daughters, beware of kind smiles from those with too much power, beware of doors that close too quietly, beware of women who speak of purity with eyes that glitter like knives, because monsters are not strangers in the dark. They are neighbors, benefactors, saints in black lace, and Guadalupe Bejarano remains the proof. Mexico's first serial killer, buried in an unmarked grave, yet alive in the whispers of a city that still hears the echoes of her victims on cold, sleepless nights.